Hello everyone and welcome to one of our knowledge transfer sessions. Today we're going to be talking about the concept of fixed index annuities. One of what I would argue is one of the more complicated styles of annuities. They can seem simple if you just look at the marketing. I would actually argue these are much more complicated than the average person knows. And I would say it's more of a trust me sale when you buy one from an agent or an advisor. So let's talk about what I would say is a more complicated subject. Now, as we always talk about all these presentations, today's information is to be treated as general in nature. Whenever we do a presentation, we're trying to summarize complex financial things. We're trying to make some basic assumptions that we can't always disclose everything. And so, recognize there's no product pitches in here, and this has to be treated as a general presentation. A little bit about myself. I have more than 18 years experience in the financial services industry. I've worked everywhere from a bank to selling mutual funds to working inside an insurance company, which is very valuable for today. So I've been around the block a little bit, and my primary focus is in Washington State, next to Overlake Hospital here in Bellevue, Washington. Now, today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what is a fixed index annuity. What is this product that, honestly, is a major sold product now in the financial services industry. And then so we're going to talk about the concept of what it is, and then we're going to talk about the basics of the interest rate guarantee with a question mark. And then we're going to actually kind of talk about some of the problems with this product. I said this is a more complicated product, and so I think there's more nuanced problems that don't get brought up in sales presentations. And then we'll actually talk about, is this a good idea or not? Because I think these aren't necessarily terrible. They're just a little more nuanced than your normal annuity. So let's talk about the concept of the fixed indexed annuity. And I remember when I first started my career, these were just starting to kick off a little bit. They were newer products. And most of the time people were using either variable annuities or fixed annuities. And this one kind of slowly but surely took over a lot of insurance companies as their core product that they were selling. And so when we use the word annuity, we always remind people the word annuities is a broad word. It can mean all sorts of different things. And so today what we're talking about very specifically is a fixed index annuity, and we're not going to add any riders to it, like an income rider, because when you add a rider, it fundamentally changes almost any annuity contract, and the rider becomes the dominant point of the conversation. So actually, that's an important reminder for today is if you're ever looking at annuities, make sure you understand what the riders are on there, because that's your primary driver of cost and modifications of contracts. Now, the fixed index annuity is kind of one of the newer kids on the block. It's not the newest annuity iteration out there, but it did start occurring really in the 1990s. And so it's something that's now been around about 35 years, but not every insurance company's had this around 35 years. Some have had it around 20 years, 15 years. So for a lot of insurance companies, it is technically a newer product, whereas everything else might have hundreds of years of history, depending upon the product we're talking about, basically. But what we're talking about today is that we're talking about a product that was trying to replace a situation where you had really high market returns in the 90s. This was before the 2000 crash, basically, or the dot-com bubble, where you were creating the dot-com bubble during this time. So people really wanted investments over fixed annuities, i.e., I want to make 5% a year. And so those products were struggling. An insurance company figured out, well, what if I could offer you market returns and not the market risk, basically, that might come along with it. And that's where the concept of the fixed index annuity came around, was the idea that we're going to give you market returns without the risk. And this is a sales pitch I actually pulled directly from an insurance company brochure. Whenever we take information from a insurance company or product, we actually don't disclose the company or the product, because we don't, A, want to try and actually sell one of these products to you on these videos, and B, the companies don't always like it when you're using their name in a video. But basically, this is your basic sales pitch for an index annuity. We're going to protect your money, principal protection. We're going to give you tax-deferred growth on your money, and it's going to be tied to an index, right? So we're thinking about the S&P 500. So if you think about it, that's really strong. That's like the idea of, I'm going to make market returns without the risk. That sounds kind of cool. And so that's what we have to explore today. We need to explore Is it taking the performance of an index? Is it doing this? How is it doing this? Then we need to talk about what is the contractual guarantee or protection. And then we have to talk about, the trade-off here, the give up of liquidity, right? So we're going to explore all these ideas in context around the idea of a fixed index annuity. So let's talk about the basics of the interest rate guarantee. How are you getting market returns without the risk? Well, as I always mentioned, before we get into the mechanics, whenever we're talking about interest derived inside an annuity insurance contract, there's some very specific kind of tax rules that come into play here. These are tax deferred until withdrawn. The interest comes in last in, first out. So if you made $1 of interest, that's the first thing that comes out, and that's what's taxable to you. These are income taxable at death. And if you take them before age 59 and a half, there is a 10% tax penalty. So these are typically retiree products because of that. And before we get into the actual interest rate guarantees, recognize there's a lot of different factors that affect these interest rate guarantees. So if you go to explore these yourself, recognize your deposit amount, your surrender schedule, riders, I mentioned that earlier, company ratings, just basic timing. All sorts of factors can affect your interest rate guarantees. But when you look at an index annuity, you're going to see something like this. And you're going to see something called a crediting strategy. Crediting strategy is how the interest is calculated. And then you're going to see some type of percentage, and it tells you how much you can make. So let's say the S&P annual point-to-point with participation rate. What does that mean? Well, it's going to track the S&P 500 on an annual point-to-point. So if you buy this January 1st, it's going to look at December 31st and see what the market did for that year. And then you're going to make this percentage for that year as an interest calculation. And then that interest is banked into the contract, basically. So in future years, if there's market losses, you don't lose that interest you made, and the overall principal doesn't go backwards either. Okay, and so that's what an annual point-to-point calculation works. And there's different types of calculations, but each of these options on here are usually tracking different indexes for different times periods. So like the S&P 500 daily risk control 5% excess annual return index is actually a different index than the S&P 500. I always find it interesting on there they don't actually highlight the rest of it because it is fundamentally different. And that's why it's offering a percentage rate of 140% because you're not getting the S&P 500 at 140%. You're getting this daily risk controlled index, which is technically lower volatility, which is why it has a higher participation rate. And so that percentage you see on this screen right here is called a participation rate. That means that if the market goes up 12, you make 65% of that in that very top left option, basically. And because we're still kind of in this kind of inverted yield curve environment, you'll notice that the 10-year products have a little worse rates than the 5-year products on certain bands. You wouldn't expect that based upon just general rules of thumb, but that's sometimes reality when you price these things out. Now, most of these are either going to be a S&P 500 participation rate, annual point-to-point, or what's called a cap rate. So the difference between a cap rate and a participation rate is a cap rate says if the market goes up 12, you make up to this percentage, and you don't go over. If the market goes backwards, you don't lose any interest that year, you just don't make any interest that year. And so the other common one you're going to see is the S&P 500 annual point-to-point cap rate. And in this case, it's 8%. But you're going to have all these other index options and all these other potential cap rates you could do. And there's nuance around this of, if you're really looking at this, the volatility, and you're really trying to do some basic predicting of the markets, you might want to blend some of these concepts, or you might want to just choose the one you think is best. But most people are going to do the S&P 500 in some version. And so to really simplify this, we're going to use an 8% S&P 500 cap rate. If the market goes up 15%, you make 8% interest. Well, I like that. I like that better than a 4% interest CD, which at this time when I was running this, interest rates for CDs are around 4.1%. So that's kind of cool. If the S&P 500 goes up 4%, well, then you make 4% because you didn't go over your cap. That's okay. And if the market goes down 20%, you don't go down in this example. You just make 0% interest in the year, which if you compare that to a CD that could have paid 4 in all examples, that might not be as exciting with number 3. But that's your basic math here. With an S&P 500 point-to-point with a cap rate. If you did participation rate, you'd multiply those percentages at the left by, say, 55%, and that's what you would make during that time period. And so what we typically suggest, what you should always consider when you're looking at any insurance product, is try and get what's called an illustration. Insurance companies are allowed to make good faith estimates on their products using what's called illustrations. And the illustrations are really good like guiding posts, benchmarks to kind of figure out how any product can work in the insurance world, from life insurance to immediate annuities to index annuities to fixed annuities to variable annuities. The illustration is really good, okay, but not perfect, okay. And you're gonna notice here I wrote down the illustration. You'll see the slide again with some fine print added. I'm gonna make this more complicated. But if you run an illustration on the 55% point to point, and you kind of did the math of, well, sometimes I'm going to get 0, sometimes I'm going to get 55% of a big number, like say 20%. What are my averages? What can this do in different market conditions? And this is kind of one of the points of friction to start with here, because there are different market conditions, so you can't guarantee this like say a 4% CD. You're going to have different ranges. And when you run illustrations, you might see that the ranges might be between 3.67 and 8.63% based upon a bad market timing scenario and a good market timing scenario. Well, that looks interesting to me. You're going to see that the average based upon the last recency bias, I always call it, is about 7.81. That's interesting to me if you compare it to fixed interest rates at 4%. And you're going to see this guaranteed minimum column showing that you're going to always get 0%. And we'll, like I said, we're going to talk about this in a future slide. But, that would be your worst case scenario. That's kind of interesting, right? So you have something that has the potential to absolutely dominate what a CD is doing, but maybe not, right? You can't guarantee it. And there are scenarios here where it clearly wouldn't. And we have to talk about one final slide about the rate scenarios here for a fixed index annuity, and it's how you create the rates. How are these rates created? And this might be a little bit more nuanced than the average person wants to get from even watching a video like this. But A, I really love the financial services industry, so I like to really dive into these things. And B, can you spot the problem here? Because you're going to see the problem with these products on the next couple of slides. So let's say you buy a 5-year contract at $100,000. The insurance company knows they're going to have the money for roughly 5 years. And they're going to be able to buy 5-year fixed interest rate investments, a pool of them. And let's say today that 5 years of investments is going to pay roughly 5%. They want to make profit on it. They need to pay commissions to people like me. They need to pay payroll to internal people. And so let's say at 5%, they need to keep back 2% for themselves. So you're only getting 3 out of the 5. And that's not super exciting, but that gives them a budget to buy options. Okay, it's called an options budget. And what they can now do is they can buy at the money call options, which are kind of expensive. And then they sell out of the money call options. And what they're doing is they're balancing these two types of options, what they're buying and what they're selling, so that the middle's the 3%. Okay, so that 3% number is critical because it's what's between the two options they're buying and selling. Okay, and that's how they created that 8% cap rate or that 55% participation rate, because they did all this balancing technique. Pretty sophisticated math, but not crazy by historical standards. This is something that is consistently done in the financial services industry across the spectrum. And they created a basic banding of what a product can do. And then they're going to renew these options annually. So what's the catch here? Like, this isn't terrible when you first look at it. They're going to protect you from the market going backwards. You have a reasonable basis to make 7 to 8%, but not guaranteed. You might make a little over 3. And this is based upon timing today. There is always a chance you could get 0% interest across all years of the contract, but that's not very probable at all. So it's pretty safe, it feels like, right? So what's the catch here? Well, let's talk about the problems with products like this. And so the first is that whenever you buy an annuity product, you have to manage the surrender schedule. And most of these products being sold today are in the 7 or 10 year bands. You can buy them in the 5-year bands, but I usually see 5, 7, or 10 year bands, which means if you're going to get out of this early, it's going to be very painful. It's going to be very expensive. You should always look for your 10% free withdrawal in these products, but I've started to see those getting eroded, which is a problem. So you really want to be able to manage these surrender schedules. And in my always rule of thumb is it has to have the 10% free withdrawal so you can get money out when you materially need it. And then almost all these products have something called market value adjustment, which is a secondary surrender charge, or it actually can give you money back. But based upon the bond markets, if the insurance company had to sell it and they had these bonds worth 5% interest and they had to sell those in the open market and they take a loss, they're going to pass those losses on to you. So the point of these two slides is to point out that if you're going to cancel the entire contract, it's going to be materially painful. You will take some losses on that. And then I mentioned this earlier. Could you spot the problem with how they calculate the interest rate guarantee? If you read the fine print of every single one of the rate sheets, the brochures, everything, they talk in the big print. They talk about the process, the interest rates, how it can protect you. Right, that marketing pitch. I'm going to protect you from market risk. I'm going to grow your money, which are all true. But there's some stuff in the fine print. And what they point out in the fine print is when they go through this process here. Well, the options are only bought annually or every 2 years. And when you're buying options like that, you're going to have some years where things change on you. Options can and do get more expensive or even less expensive, but sometimes more expensive. And what happens when options get more expensive is instead of you getting an 8% cap rate, the insurance company every year has the right to lower the cap rate on your contract. And that's a problem because they don't always do that. There's some secondary nuance to this. But if they have the ability to every year take your 8% cap rate and make it 4%, which means you make half the amount of interest, that's a problem. And there could be good reasons they do that. In fact, if you really look at how options work and trying to buy these more sophisticated products, solutions across all sorts of different styles, actually, this is just a natural problem with this. But this is normally sold to consumers, little old ladies who are in their 70s or 80s. And that's a problem right there, that the interest rates can change down the road. And to really drive home the point, I showed you this slide earlier. I said there's some fine print here. And when you run an illustration, you're going to see language like this. And it literally says in the illustration, it can do all these things at the top. Totally true. But it's not likely to. But what? Because they can change the participation rate, that 55% number, which is the core math, how this illustration was run. They can change that after the first year. And because they can, and because the options pricing might force them to, right? You can have the most reputable, awesome insurance company in the world who you absolutely trust. And they could still change the rates on you because they're just forced to because of the rate environment. And they don't take the loss themselves. That would be crazy. So they'll pass it to you. And so what happens here is because these products are more complicated, if you catch them at the wrong time, you could materially have lower interest than you signed up for because that's what the contract reads. And their fine print all says it. And the last one is another problem. This is a practice management problem for me. Practice management is how you want all your client experiences to go for each of your clients to make sure you have a consistent client experience. And one of the problems I run into with these products is all those other problems I can get around. But what invariably happens is I'll sell this to two different people, and they'll be at two different times. And one person will make the 8% interest and the other person won't. And it's just purely based upon the timing of when you bought it. Because remember, an annual point-to-point could be January to December 31st, but it could be July to June, right? It's just when you buy your contract. And this is crippling because someone could see that the market's up 20% all year, and they're like, I'm going to make my 8%. And then next year it crashes, and they make 0%, and they just are angry because they were expecting to get 8, and they end up getting 0. They were protected materially, but they just didn't make their interest that year. And that's a bad client experience. It's really emotionally tough. And then part two of that is, let's say it generally works out, but it works out in the lower end. The average person's going to go, well, okay, I made 3.67. Oh, I listened to you, but I could have done this other thing earning 5%, or current rates are 5%, right? So it's kind of a bad client experience problem when you use these products, and you're not careful, basically. So is this a good idea? I mean, I've trashed this pretty good. I've pointed out the insurance could be lower your rates. I've pointed out this could be a bad client experience problem. Is there anything good in here? So the first thing I'll mention is, usually when you buy these products, it's a trust me sale. You're trusting the person you're buying from because it's complicated, and it really is. And you're at least locking up a portion of your money, right? You always got to understand when you're buying these types of annuities, you are locking up your money. And you usually need to put more money in. So it's kind of harder to buy these if you're just trying to buy $50,000. You can, but usually your best rates are at $100,000 or more. And just as with any annuity product, depending upon your investment capabilities, you can potentially beat this. Like the S&P 500, we would say would absolutely beat this on the long term. There are points in history it doesn't. Actually, there are literally points in history where the S&P 500 loses to these products. But if we're talking about low or long term, if we're talking about the most people's scenario, the S&P 500 probably beats this. And remember, you have to assume the insurance company won't materially change rates. They actually don't want to materially change rates. It's really bad for them when they materially change rates, because then people don't want to sell their products anymore and they don't make money. So they actually will even publish rate histories to show they won't materially change rates. And that's really good. Like, that's kind of one of your baselines. Before you buy one of these products, you want to probably look at your rate history. That's what I do before I offer it to someone. But insurance companies, they don't fail very often, but they can go through tough times. And when they go through tough times, or they get sold to another insurance company, they oftentimes drop the rates on these products. They just materially just go, nope, we don't care about new sales. We're going through tough times, or we've sold our company. New sales aren't relevant to us anymore. And so you'll find that in general, insurance companies don't like to lower these rates, and so they don't very often, unless market conditions force them to. But then a certain subset of those insurance companies will be sold or run into problems, and that subset of the whole will lower rates. And then, as always, you have to interact with an insurance agent, and it's hard to buy things from people. There's a lot of emotion around that. Plus, you have to rely on someone to be competent and not, just hammer you all the time. And with this product, there's something interesting about when we talk about annuities. Annuities are, a lot of times the concept is buying guarantees, right? To guarantee or not to guarantee, that's the question with annuities. Do you want guarantees in your retirement profile? What's the guarantee here? You can't guarantee the interest because you just don't know what the interest rates are going to do. You don't know what your options are going to be long term. And really, if you look at the guarantee here is that basic idea, we're going to protect you from market risk. Doesn't mean you make money. It means that you're not going to go backwards. Now, weird thing is when you talk about modeling for retirement planning, that's actually valuable, but you won't like it. But we have to always talk about this in context, right? I think I've thoroughly trashed this pretty good. But in context, these aren't bad. And the reason is because, if you're looking at your standard target date fund, and this is Fidelity's target date fund, which is a very suitable investment for a lot of retirees, you're going to see about 25% of your money is earning about 2.41%. And that's not very good. Like, if you compare the index annuity to this, the index annuity starts to look a lot better. And then we talk about, money market accounts, or money market funds. Money market funds have really taken the financial services industry by storm for the last couple of years. In fact, they're almost everything you want. They're liquid, they pay good interest, and there's really no major risks with them. There are some, but they're not usually considered to be major. But money market funds do have a basic problem, and we don't talk about it very much right now. But the basic problem is if interest rates ever get lowered at the Fed level, you should expect these to go down pretty quickly. And, right now I'm shooting this video, there's a lot of talk about Jerome Powell and President Trump wanting interest rates to be lowered significantly. You may want to lock in your rates sooner rather than later. And if we're talking about that scenario, and we're comparing an index annuity to, say, a money market fund, an index annuity should beat a money market fund, like, materially in a lowering interest rate scenario if you buy it early enough, because you get to lock in interest. You don't get to lock in options pricing, but you do get to lock in interest rates, which is an important part of the equation. And then when you look at other options, right? You can buy CDs, you can buy all sorts of different bonds, and I got this from Schwab's website. So this is just an overview of bonds back on June 26th, and it just gives you this idea that these are other things you can do. But when you look at these interest rates, they're not that exciting. They're good, like, they do their job, but they're not that exciting, especially when you think about inflation. And so an index annuity, when you compare it to this, and you kind of look at everything has problems, probably not a terrible idea. So, we prefer process and not product here, right? So this is a tool in a specific retirement style. In fact, I consider this tool to be the one I don't offer to people unless I really trust them, because they are more complicated. And if one of the challenges you run in practice management is if you give someone a complicated option and 2 years down the road they want to go, what the heck did I buy? That's a really tough thing with these products. A well-rounded plan explores this and other options. I showed you that target date fund. Suitable investment that might be more your style, or something more asset allocation style. But don't ignore it. And don't ignore tax deferral. It can be a very important part of retirees' process, or just tax management. And these work pretty well there. And then I look at a lot of index annuities. I look at a lot of different types of annuities, and that's true for stocks, that's true for bonds, it's true for ETFs. But because I can earn commissions on these products, I will tell you that you really do want to comparison shop these, because the difference between two companies can be significantly thousands of dollars in your pocket. So definitely do this from a brokerage standpoint if you really go down this path, which is hard because these are trust me sales more than almost any other. So we're here to help. We're based in Washington State, but you're welcome to reach out to us, bug us, and just see if you have any other questions on this topic. I hope this was helpful. From here, what we'll do is we'll do one more video on annuities. It's going to be on the newest kid on the block, RILAs, or Registered Index Linked Annuities, which is very wild as compared to this. So we'll do that video, and then we'll be done with annuities for a while, and we'll talk about other retirement topics. Thank you, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.